Given two quantities, we can talk about the difference between the two quantities. There's some ambiguity in the term. There is a difference between 240 and 400, but is it the same as the difference between 400 and 240? The problem is that when we subtract, we refer to the result as a difference. So 18 minus 12 is 6, and so we say 6 is the difference between 18 and 12. But we could also perform the subtraction in another way. 12 minus 18 is negative 6. So we could say that negative 6 is the difference between 12 and 18. On the other hand, the difference between 18 and 12 seems like it should be the same as the difference between 12 and 18. In both cases, the two numbers are 6 apart. To avoid ambiguity, we can talk about the absolute difference, which is always the larger value minus the smaller value. So we can talk about the absolute difference between 240 and 400, which is larger minus smaller. So the larger value is 400, and the smaller value is 240, and so that difference is 160. When speaking of the difference, we can avoid all ambiguity by relating all three numbers: the smaller number, the larger value, the difference, and what you could think about as the direction. So we could say that 400 is 160 more than 240. Or we could say that 240 is 160 less than 400. Now there's a second difference we could talk about. The relative difference is the ratio between the two quantities. However, as with absolute difference, which ratio we use is a little more complicated. There's a few ways to decide which ratio to use. If both values exist in some sense simultaneously, for example, two weights, then we usually use the ratio of the larger value divided by the smaller value and say that the larger value is that many times the smaller value. For example, 2 bags of sugar contain 400 grams and 200 grams. What's the relative difference between the two bags? Since we have two separate bags, then the weights exist simultaneously. So we'll find that quotient larger value divided by a smaller value. So that's 400 divided by 200, which is 2. The important thing to remember is we should always answer the question in the same language it was asked. Here, the question was asked in English, so a math answer of 2 is not complete. We should say that the larger bag has 2 times, twice, the weight of the smaller bag. It's also possible that the values exist in sequence. For example, how much money you have on Monday compared to how much you have on Tuesday. In that case, we usually find the end value divided by the start value. We usually convert this value into a percentage and describe our result as ending with some percentage of the original amount. For example, suppose at the start of an experiment you have 25 grams of a substance, while at the end you have 20 grams. What's the relative difference between the initial and final values? Note that we started with 25 grams and ended with 20 grams. So we'll use that quotient end divided by start, 20 divided by 25. We'll calculate that as, and remember, to convert to a percentage, we'll multiply the decimal value by 100. And so that gives us 80%. And again, we should answer the question in the same language it was asked. The question is in English. We should answer as an English sentence. So we'll say that we end with 80% of what we started with. There's another way we can describe this difference. If we change the amount of something from one value to another value, then we have 100% of the quantity at the start, and we have some percentage of the quantity at the end. So we could talk about the absolute difference of the percentages. So again, let's take our same experiment. We've already determined that we ended with 80% of what we started with. Since we started with everything, 100%, but ended with 80%, the absolute difference of the percentages is 20. So we can say that we ended with 20% less than what we started with. Now here it's very important to pay attention to the grammar. So suppose you invest $1,000 and at the end of the year you have $1,200. Find and describe the percentage change. Since these values have a beginning and an end, we'll find the quotient end divided by start, which will be, and we can calculate that as, and again, to convert this into a percentage, we'll multiply by 100 to get. So we can say that we ended with 120% of what we started with. Or we can also say that we ended with 20% more than what we started with. And it's very important to distinguish between the two statements. For example, if an investment promises to return 75% of what you invest, is that a good investment? As it's written, it means that if you started with 100%, the whole amount that you invested, you'd end with 75%. So you'd actually lose a lot. Now, it's possible that the copy was badly written and that the writer meant to say that it would return 75% more than what you started with, but find out before you give them any money.